the Development Advisory Panel, where we're focusing on international development. And so the format today will be sort of 40-minute or so presentation, and then open the floor to questions. So yeah, think of your questions as we go along, and I hope it'll be a great afternoon. So I'll just do a short introduction, and then I'll hand over to you, Tom. So Tom has very kindly joined us. He's an environmental social scientist at University of Exeter, where he studies the relationship between the natural environment and well-being. Through an interdisciplinary approach focusing on social ecological systems, pro-environmental behaviour and wellbeing literature, Tom explores how best to ensure that conservation and natural resource management measures are contributing to poverty alleviation. His research is primarily focused along the coast and has recently explored the links between coastal ecosystem services, their management and wellbeing, and the relationship between social inequalities and environmental behaviours. So he's excellently placed to share his knowledge and his experience on the topic today, which the title of which is The Need for an Interdisciplinary Approach to Tackling Marine and Coastal Sustainability Issues. So yeah, thank you very much for joining us, Tom. And just one admin point for me. I'm going to have to drop off towards the end, but Estelle will take over and chair the questions towards the end. But yeah, very much looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. So over to you, Tom. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lorna. Hi, everyone. Let me just try and share this, see if it works. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to present. Can you just see the slides, or can you see notes as well?
Just the slides, yeah, that works.
Just the slides? Wonderful.
Yeah.
There's no notes anyway. I don't know why I asked that, but anyway, you get the gist. So yeah, thanks a lot. I've given a few presentations to a few of you already, and I wanted to try and take a different take on it. Although I think in the conclusion you won't be surprised by what I say if you know me a little bit. And I'm taking this. I use this opportunity to take this this question and really reflect on the need for an interdisciplinary approach, rather than just try and say that it's great, which is often what people are saying more and more. So I'll go through it. I should note the pictures in the background aren't my own pictures. I was going to do that, and then I ran out of time. So I just put some pretty fish in some of the slides. So none of those are mine, but legally obtained from the internet. Okay, so I'll start by really doing what most people would do, I think, and by talking about the limitations of disciplinary approaches, just sort of generally in terms of science, and then we'll zoom in very quickly after a few slides into the sort of marine realm. So the emergence of interdisciplinary work has happened for quite a long time now. I mean, it used to be that progress in society really depended on progress in science, and these two things were very much separate. And that went along for quite a long time, from the period of the Enlightenment onwards. But then people started realizing that the application of these scientific insights and this scientific knowledge to the life world, was not always easy. It had pros and cons. It often led to sort of consequences either relatively quickly or long term after. And increasingly, there was this understanding that we need to consider the context in which we're sort of applying these scientific advancements, both to make sure that these advances actually work, but also to make sure that they don't lead to unintended consequences and harm to people or the environment. And so there's really interdisciplinary work has come out of this desire to this demand for new forms of research, new forms of science, which actually try to prevent and mitigate these unintended consequences. So very often in sustainability research, we think a lot of the issues that we face, both terrestrial and marine, as wicked problems. And I mean, there's a whole book written on it, and I'm not going to go into a huge amount of depth here. But basically, we live in an increasingly connected world, and the key focus of the talk today, although I think we could sort of embellish it further, is that there is a crucial link between social and ecological systems. We'll come to that a little bit more later on, and that of course these links play across different scales and across different time periods. And those are really key aspects of what I want to talk about today. But really, the next thing about a wicked problem is not just that everything's connected, is that the effort to solve one might actually reveal or create other problems. And this is what we found sort of time and time again. Really, it's the norm rather than the exception. And so if we're going to tackle these complex problems, which are very much the case for sustainability issues, we need to consider both social and ecological dimensions. Now, of course, that means that we need different concepts, different frameworks, different approaches, different methods, different ways of thinking, and therefore different disciplines if we want to consider social and ecological dimensions. So in a way, this is why I sort of freaked out when I saw the title of this talk, because I thought I could just end there. This is basically, we live in a social ecological system. There's a social dimension, an ecological dimension. We're completely intertwined, and therefore it's crazy to not consider sustainability challenges as not one that requires an interdisciplinary approach, or at the very least a multidisciplinary. We'll talk about the benefits of interdisciplinary in particular in a little while. But what this can do is to tackle wicked problems, we need social and ecological, but also explore, be a little bit more creative, and be a little bit more open-minded. And sometimes to fix a problem, to fix a fisheries problem might not be about going into the fisheries. It might be going into family planning or education or alleviating poverty through other means. I mean, there's a whole host of ways to reach solutions. And sometimes you've got to think outside the box with these sort of complex interconnected systems that we work with. And so, the end of this book, which is really interesting, actually, about wicked problems. This is about transdisciplinary work, which we're not talking about today particularly, which is sort of the involvement of non-academia in dealing with sustainability issues. But Brown sort of summarizes this by saying there is an inherent inability of narrow solutions to inform sustainable decisions. So in particular, in a world that's incredibly interconnected, that is changing very quickly, these narrow solutions that sometimes work, but still sometimes work, these sort of technical fixes are just not enough. Now, at no point, I'm not going to dwell on this, but at no point am I suggesting that we shouldn't have disciplinary work. I mean, clearly we do, but it doesn't go far, it doesn't complete the whole picture. It doesn't necessarily go far enough. So applying this thinking to, thinking about a bit of a thought experiment is thinking through marine protected areas as a bit of a technical fix. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for marine protected areas. I'm not trying to be negative about them in the slightest. They're a great idea for many reasons, but it is a rather disciplinary at its core. And when it all started off, a bit of a technical sort of disciplinary fix to a rather complex sustainability issue. And we could think about any form of marine spatial planning or any form of marine and coastal management. And I could use that example and run through it in a similar way. It just so happens I know more about marine protected areas, which are, basically there to rebuild fish populations, to be able to mitigate the impacts of climate change, become more resilient to climate change. And of course, a key sort of tenet of this is the long-term sort of economic stability and well-being benefits that it might provide to communities. It's a very palatable and very convincing argument about how great marine protected areas are and that we should have many of them, right? And from a disciplinary perspective, there is still a lot of work that has been done, and I've not caught up with it as much in the last few years, but presumably there's still a lot of work to be done. But we've come a long way. I mean, we've unpacked this from a disciplinary perspective quite a lot. Now, I know this is a sort of straying into the management a little bit, but generally speaking, marine protected area can have many different zonations. It can be no use, no take. There might be buffer zones. There might be zones that are used for certain purposes and not for others. And there's a lot of work, within the discipline, seeing how that's affected fish number, biodiversity, biomass, etc. There's a lot of work that's been done about when marine protected area thinking really first came out, but still happening about, what are the different types of marine protected areas and how they're protected and how old they are, and what do we need to get a certain amount of biomass or economic benefit or ecological benefit from it. So huge amounts of work still predominantly, not solely, but predominantly within sort of environmental management and conservation science has happened, trying to sort of measure the success of marine protected areas. And, you know, the conclusions of a lot of this sort of ecological work has been more or less the same for the last sort of couple of decades, I think. And again, I know, you know, I've not necessarily kept up to date over the last few years, but generally speaking, a larger area, an older marine protected area, one that's connected, one that is very well protected and people are excluded from, is leading to higher ecological and environmental benefits. They are working better. That's what it needs for a marine protected area to work. And so the take-home sort of message from a lot of this work is that, yes, time matters. Yes, the way it's designed matters. You know, they need to be in places that are incredibly well enforced and people, you know, can respect the rules. And because actually people, you know, need to be excluded from these systems. So going back to this idea that we live in a world that is a social ecological system where humans and, you know, and the environment and nature are very much intertwined everywhere. You know, there's not one place that's untouched. So when you think of this, that people need to be excluded and that you need to wait a long time before the benefits of something like this happens, you know, the conclusion again, and this is where social scientists have started and interdisciplinary scientists have started to come in, is this idea that any form of marine spatial planning will have implications, basically. It'll have consequences on predominantly, in this case, different people, both positive and negative. And this is really important because, you know, when we think about sustainability, it's about meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So, you know, there's a huge focus on social needs. You know, the social dimension is incredibly clear all the way through, and that there's this idea that we need to balance environment, social, and economic. So, I guess what I'm trying to say with all of this is that, you know, at its core, there needs to be, at the very least, an awareness of the role of different disciplines when tackling sustainability issues, because a sustainability issue is one that combines environment, social, and economic. Or if you're more like me, I like to put social and economic together and have ecological and social just more broadly. But whatever the case is, those two dimensions are interlinked. So at the very least, if you're disciplinary and focused, you still need to be aware of these other components, which wasn't necessarily the case quite a long time ago, and things have changed since then. So there's definitely, I think, you know, at this point, I'm hoping, and I think I'm sort of preaching to the choir here already, but I think that, you know, there is definitely a role for interdisciplinarity, right? There is a role for social scientists in this case to look at, you know, social impact of marine protected areas. There's a role of ecologists and those environmental scientists to think through the design and monitor success of them. And there's a role of people to sort of appreciate the links between the two. And, you know, increasingly, this is definitely what's happening, which is, you know, very reassuring. I mean, I think for the last sort of 10, 15 years, at the very least, most papers on marine sort of conservation, protection, environmental management, sustainability have an awareness that there are repercussions of certain changes that are put forward, and the way in which a system should be managed, or the marine ecosystem should be managed. And so whether they employ this kind of model, this social ecological system way of thinking or not, is up to them. But this idea that, you know, this idea that there is an ecosystem that has its functions, that provides benefits to people, that contributes to their well-being, and that in itself influences, based on what they prefer and what they like, influences what they do and how they act, which then feeds back into the environment. I mean, it's very much all interlinked. And so there is definitely an appreciation of that. And so, you know, these are the kinds of things, this is a very simplified version of the types of sort of discourses and discussions one one might see of those that are interested in conserving, managing, protecting the sea, but also are appreciating and at least embracing to a certain extent interdisciplinarity, that they're understanding that the social and the ecological is incredibly linked and sort of depend on each other. And so these kinds of stories come out that, fine, a marine protected area might lead to ecological success that might lead to sort of a series of benefits. And already this arrow between ecological success and economic success is rather interdisciplinary, if you're doing that properly. And then this economic success is presumed to then lead to positive attitudes because of people think positively about it. And then if they think positively about it, they're going to act in favor of it. And if they act in favor of the marine protected area, then it's more likely to work. I mean, these kinds of assumptions are made very, very often, whether they're explicitly written or whether they're just felt or whether it's a sort of feeling that's promoted. This tends to happen quite a lot. But a lot of these links are exactly that. They're incredibly simplified assumptions. And I'll come back to that in a second, just sort of hold that thought. But, when you're thinking of something like this, having different disciplines is very, very key. Thinking what ecological success might be is already a question in of itself and has been posed many times and needs a whole suite of concepts and approaches and techniques that, many of us don't have. I mean, I don't have, but again, the same might go. Those people that know about ecological success wouldn't be able to even start thinking about how to convert what's in the sea and put an economic valuation to it. And then those that have put an economic valuation to it, how that shapes attitudes, there'll be a different group of people. So even though, you can understand that to have this kind of discourse, you have to have an appreciation and you have to have the skills to be able to investigate those different parts of this story. And social sciences, for example, can add to the environmental sciences by adding different frameworks, different concepts, and more importantly, these sort of new participatory methods, these ways of actually getting perceptions and getting human perceptions of the situation. It's a different way of seeing the world. It's a very hard thing to be interdisciplinary, I think, fully interdisciplinary, especially going from one discipline to the next, because it changes the way in which you view the world. And this role of interdisciplinarity is key for a couple of main reasons. And each of you, I don't have time to do a poll, but I'd be really interested. I've had many debates and even arguments with friends and colleagues on this. Why is it that it's important to consider how a marine and coastal intervention impacts people, say? Well, some people say it's an equity and justice thing. You cannot think about sustainability even in the sort of ecological sphere, without realizing that it is about social equity. I mean, the reason why you're protecting the ocean or whatever it is or managing it is so that future generations can benefit. I mean, there is equity and justice within it. And so there is a reason to think about equity and justice and the social dimensions of all of this is because it's important in of itself, right? Whatever we do, we want to make sure that it's just. But then the next sort of more instrumental way of thinking about it is that these interventions simply don't work. And it's been found time and time again in the marine sphere in particular, but also in terrestrial systems, is if people perceive the intervention to not be fair or not be just or not be legitimate, it just won't last. And if it does last, it's because a huge amount of money has been pumped into it or because of the very rare context where people live incredibly far away from it. But even then, I would contest that. So there's two incredibly important reasons as to why we should be embracing interdisciplinarity and looking at these complex sustainability, marine and coastal sustainability issues through an interdisciplinary lens. One, to think about the consequences on people and making sure that it's just. But two, because by doing that, you're increasing the chances of success for that intervention anyway. Okay, I hope that's the right pitch and that you're sort of following the story so far. It's going to get a little bit more messy, and then hopefully I'll just sort of clear it up a little bit by the end. But in a way, a lot of the story is my story. I mean, I started in biology and ecology and got fascinated about marine protected areas, recognized there was a huge social dimension, really key to try and make marine protected areas work better, knew that justice was key to make sure that marine protected areas work better. And I guess the next few slides is continuing this story and my mild depression that ensued as I unpacked this complexity a little bit further. Because when you say interdisciplinarity or interdisciplinary work, it is a continuum. You should never think of it as a tick box exercise, which I know. Yeah, thank you. I wondered about putting that slide in, and thanks for reminding me. I'll talk about it now. And so this idea that being interdisciplinary is just a check, sort of a tick box, is a fallacy. I don't think it's very useful at all. Towards the end of this talk, I'll briefly mention that I don't really see things through an interdisciplinary lens anymore. I don't actually think it's I don't think it's a useful term anymore. I think it has had its time, and I think now we might want to focus on something else. I'll save that till the end. But I think at this point, what I wanted to say is that you can go from disciplinary thinking, as we've discussed, to multidisciplinarity, which in a way is just sort of putting different, in a project, it would be different groups of people working on different parts of something. And their report would be, this is part A, this is part B, this is part C, little conclusion. That's multidisciplinary. Nothing is sort of intertwined. Experts are looking at experts in their disciplines are looking through their lens at a problem. And this is really interesting. And it happens a lot because, if you're interdisciplinary in terms of ecological and social, the ecologists like to measure things, and that's fact, and that's truth, and that's what's observed, and that's what there is. If I perceive there to be 10 fish and you perceive there to be 5, or one of us is clearly wrong and doing a really shit job. Whereas, if you're a social scientist and you're asking somebody how many fish there are, and one says 10 and one says 5, what we're interested in very often is not just what they've said to be the truth of how many fish there are, but actually, why did one person say there was 10 and the other person say there was 5? Is it because one's more optimistic? Is it because one's trying to convince me that things are going better? Is it because that person's got a better boat and better gear and always just a better fisher? So it's the way in which we view life is completely different. And so multidisciplinary work is what happens most of the time, just because that's the way we're trained and that's how we gravitate towards things. And therefore, it's just a bunch of people doing different work on the same kind of problem and coming together later. And that's absolutely fine. There's merit to that. And I think probably most work is like that. Then there's interdisciplinary work where actually people are working together more closely. There's two ways one might think about it. It's ecologists and the social scientists just spending a lot of time together, co-creating methods and informing each other. So the work that I found then informs the ecologists to do something, and the work that they found then comes back to me and I follow it up with more social science work. That's one way. The other way is the way that I find myself is, if I was applying for a job promotion, I'd say, I'm an interdisciplinary scientist. I am great at, ecological and environmental sciences, and I'm also great at the social sciences, and I meet in the middle and I bring the two together. But to my negative self, I just say I'm pretty terrible at both ecological and social sciences. I sit in the middle and I'm neither good at either of them. So there's also I've been in projects where it's a project made up of interdisciplinary scientists, those that have either started social and gone ecological or started ecological and gone social, and they've kind of just in this sphere, which is understanding why fishers might say that, a marine protected area is not working, or they also might understand why there's tuna in the ocean and there wasn't before. They might understand, the design of marine protected areas. They might understand the ecology, and they might also be aware of full in-depth ethnography, but they sort of sit in between. And that's really where I am. I've done both. I work with ecologists as a social scientist, or sometimes I try and work as an interdisciplinary scientist myself. I don't know what's best, but I feel awkward in both. So that's sort of, I hope that answered your question. I can't see the name of the person that did now, but I hope that answered your question. The key point I wanted to take from this slide is that it's a continuum. You're not just multidisciplinary and then interdisciplinary. You can do it terribly. And I think a lot of people that started off with this slide I wanted to show you earlier on would start for themselves. People that maybe did some marine protected area sort of success work, and then counted the number of fish that was landed, and then talked to people about their attitudes, and then asked them whether they complied. I think a lot of people did some terrible interdisciplinary work, And when I say people, this came from one of my papers, so that people might be me. But the point is, that's some terrible work because it's very simplified and it's very naive. And really, I think if you're embracing interdisciplinary work, you need to really understand things a little bit further. I think there's limitations of light interdisciplinarity, and the strength of going a little bit deeper. This graph is, this figure is just to show that, that this win-win narrative doesn't work at all. And you could talk to a social scientist, and they would have known that before anyone wasted time looking into it. A marine protected area is going to impact people differently, even if it's in the rare instances where it's working incredibly well and it's doing all the benefits that it said it was going to do. It changes the winners and losers of a system. Certain people will benefit more out of a marine protected area than others. In my case, it was, people that could speak English that already had quite a lot of money were very keen on the marine protected area because their divers, for their dive industry would come and spend a lot of money to dive, and a lot of people were just very jealous and thought this was incredibly unfair, not legitimate, and actually undermined the marine protected area despite the fact it was doing well. And there was temptation for those people because they felt that things were so unfair. They were like, well, I'm going to break the rules because I'm not doing incredibly well. I know the marine protected area is. And what was interesting is a lot of people perceived the marine protected area to do badly. Whether or not it was doing badly is not really that important. The fact is their expectations were shattered. And the danger there is that if anybody comes in with any other environmental management idea, they'll just be scared of it and say no. So it's just to sort of say that, this is a very sort of oversimplified notion, but it's just to say that I think it's important to not just say I'm doing interdisciplinary work. I think it's much safer to do disciplinary work unless you do interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary work. I think if you do interdisciplinary work, you've got to be incredibly careful about it. So that's one take-home message. But what's happening at the moment is, which I find really interesting, is that there's been this change at the way we look at marine conservation and conservation in general. It was before a beautiful thing that we must sort of protect and keep and look pretty. And obviously have all the wonderful species within it. And in the 1990s, it became more something that we needed to prevent people like us messing it up. So it was more really about protecting from us. And then in the 2000s with the MEA, Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, it was more about managing marine systems so that they can continue to provide us with benefits. And that's sort of when I came into the arena. And then more recently, it's this idea that we're so intrinsically linked and that things are constantly changing. How do we manage something that's always changing, that we're within, and that we're in a slightly different situation. And I think this trajectory reflects a very interdisciplinary journey from disciplinary to multi to rather more inter, and to, I think, sort of a deeper interdisciplinary engagement that's happening. So I guess what I wanted to say from this is that, any form of marine spatial planning, wherever it is going to have implications for both ecological and social systems. It's not just an ecological question, it's a social one as well, as we all know. What's interesting is understanding these implications could be done incredibly simply. And this is what's happening so much at the moment in that, if you follow any of the positive tipping points literature, that's very much a simplistic understanding, I think, of what the impacts are going to be on people. Of course, if you think at a planetary scale, protecting 30% of the oceans is going to be an amazing thing. I'm not debating that. But if you're thinking at a short time scale and you're thinking about poor, impoverished communities, the location of these marine protected areas, how big they are, how connected they are, how screwed up people are already in terms of reducing fish catches and other issues, means that actually the implications now, the implications later, and how those implications change in different places is incredibly important. And this is sort of, in 2015 onwards, or 2010, on the basis of this Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, there was this sort of simplistic idea that ecosystem services contribute to well-being, and we just need to find out a little bit more about it. To try and understand, because by understanding how people derive benefits from nature, we can understand how changing and managing nature is going to lead to implications. What are the implications of managing for nature? We only know that when we know how people derive benefits from it, right? So if people get a lot of money from fishing, if we prevent everyone from fishing, they're not going to get as much money. It's just trying to understand how these things all connect up. And this really needed to be mapped. Because at the same time, a lot of people were just a little bit unclear. If the environment is so good for people's well-being, why is it that everyone's well-being has gone up at the expense of the environment? There's a sort of paradox at play that just doesn't really work. If anyone hasn't read, this paper reads like a Sherlock Holmes. I love it. It puts out these different hypotheses, and it's really fun to read. And there's a follow-up as well. But there's this idea that this idea that there is just one arrow is overly simplistic. So now things get a little bit messy. If you manage the environment for ES1 is let's just say, I don't know, fish, and ES2 is mangroves. If you manage the coastal environment for fish, well, then all the fishes are going to win, and all the mangrove loggers are going to lose out. I mean, I'm not saying they're not necessarily losing out, but one group of people are getting a benefit and not of the other. That's a decision. That's a political decision to be made. There's a trade-off there. Who do you benefit, the mangrove loggers or the fishers, and why? That's not terribly important. What's more important is if by trying to protect the fishery or the coral reef, you're leading to a negative impact on the mangroves. Then it becomes a difficult trade-off position. Then the social sciences become critical, because what you're doing is you're managing the fish for the fishes, and you're screwing over the mangrove loggers. And these kinds of things happen all the time. This is not a rare sort of instance. These kinds of trade-offs between ecosystem services and who depends on them happens all the time. A second story is that you benefit the fishery, for example, but person A doesn't have a boat and person B does. This happens all the time. A small community-based marine protected area right opposite the beach, opposite the village, so that everyone can monitor it. Great. People with the boats can just shunt over around it. People without have to paddle a long way now around this marine protected area unless certain concessions are allowed. Again, there's a trade-off there. And so I won't go into to all of these in the interest of time, but the point being is that there are reasons why enhancing the environment and protecting it doesn't always lead to increases in well-being. One of them is that it benefits some people and not others in the shorter term. And I think, and others are, that it benefits one place and not another. There's a huge series of different trade-offs that are at play. And I'm reminding you now that all of this is to just try and understand what the implications, the social implications are of marine and coastal sustainability interventions. Because people can't know how it's going to impact people unless we know how we derive well-being from it. And this is work that's still going on in many different countries to try and find out what's going on. This work here about was a very interdisciplinary project. So you can see this conceptual framework. Some people were looking at the ecological stocks and the state of ecosystems. Some people were looking about more the sort of economics angle of what are the different goods people are getting of nature and their value. Some people were looking at the different share and access issues that people were getting, and others were looking at, people's well-being, the contribution of these environmental goods to their well-being, and depending on how much they need from it. And so we did this work for a long time, and with the idea of how do we manage? We know that people have made loads of mistakes trying to manage the sea and do things the right way, conserve the ocean, manage fish stocks, try and do the right thing, and it's led to unintended consequences. It's often pushed the poorer deeper into poverty. So what we wanted to do is, how do we carry out environmental management of these oceans, of these mangroves, of these coral reefs, so that it positively affects the well-being of the poor? And we found out that we had to do a few things. We had to really find out what it is from the environment people are depending on. it's not just fish. It's a hell of a lot of other stuff, be it octopus or shells, things that we kind of know, honey, medicine, mangrove poles. But when you're thinking of these coastal communities, there are also slightly rarer things like using places in the mangroves as a toilet, using aspects of the mangroves for fuel, et cetera, dye production. There were some other interesting bits that came out. And of course, tourism had different facets as well. And each site that we looked at here in Kenya and Mozambique had a different flavor. The second thing we had to do is not just what it is that people depend on in the environment here in these coastal communities, but it was also what is well-being? What do we mean by that? It's not just about money, which is so often focused. It's about a whole host of other things: material well-being, relational well-being, subjective well-being. So we had to think a lot about that. And this is me actually learning to become more of a social scientist, because I'm faced with this problem of not knowing how changes are going to impact the poor, because I just don't know what the poor depend on and what they what we mean by poor, or what we mean by poverty. And in fact, I ended up being very confused, because we had 4 different measures of poverty. You could be income poor, you could be poor in terms of not meeting your basic needs, you could be poor in terms of your material style of life, or you could be poor in terms of your own perception of it, being unsatisfied with life. And what you see here, wherever these bars overlap, is when there's consensus between these 2 metrics of poverty. So you start to see how complex it is, the social sciences, when you're thinking about a sort of sustainability issue, how difficult it is to make sure that environmental management is going to benefit those most in need, when we really find it difficult to even identify who those people might be. And we also, so some of the things we found is that, people, this is in terms of fish, contributing to different basic needs, that the ways in which fish contributed to their different aspects of well-being, and this is just a few of them, were sometimes positive and sometimes negative, and differed for different groups of people. So for some people, it was food for a school lunch. For some people, it was something they could sell, and then with that money, they could buy, scholarly equipment in terms of education. So the ways in which it hit different basic needs, and different aspects of well-being differed. And what we found is that, based on the different, the darker green cells are just highlighting the percentage of people that highlighted that this is incredibly important for this well-being domain. So it meant that if it's completely white, it meant that no one said that this was important for their well-being. And you can see that, depending on the site, there are some similarities, but there are some differences, and different aspects of the environment are contributing strongly or weakly to many different aspects of well-being. I'm coming close to the end, don't worry. A key point that we found is that, if you're managing the sea, who are you managing it for? If you thought about the jobs and the livelihoods that men and women had in our sites in Kenya, the men were involved in pole cutting, tourism, and fishing and fish trading. And those are the most sort of economically valuable sort of trades there. So if you're managing for a fishery, and you're managing the coral reefs to try and provide more fish, essentially what you're saying is you're benefiting, men, and expecting there to be a trickle-down benefit for women in the household and for the wider community, which is fine, because there is a trickle-down effect, but there isn't always. And you're making a choice by doing that. And it's very important to be aware of it. I could be more complex, obviously if you provided a market for seaweed collection and made that lucrative, then I'm sure men would probably jump in on that, and pretty predominantly led by men. But what I'm trying to say is to be aware of how this plays out for different people. And what we found is that people use, the sea and the mangroves and their benefits in different ways. Sometimes they use it directly, fish for food. Sometimes they use it for money, they sell it and they get money from it. Or sometimes it's just the experience of fishing, the friends that you make, the sense of freedom, your agency, your sense of respect and self-worth that contribute to your well-being. And all of these have different repercussions on how you use the environment. So, going back to this sort of social ecological system, in this case, we're finding that from coastal ecosystem services are contributing to people's well-being through use, money, and experience, that if it feeds back, if you're if the benefit you get is mostly through experience, then it doesn't matter how much you catch, and that has implications for coastal resource management. If you are fishing for money, well, that's rather sort of insatiable, right? You will continue to catch, as much as you can, as long as it doesn't, screw up the system in the short term. So understanding the ways in which people benefit from the coast and why is really key to understand their behaviors, not only just generally their behaviors, but also their behaviors towards the ways in which the sea and the ocean is going to be managed for the future. So this is where I come to the limitations, and just a couple of brief slides here. We've moved now into sort of rather deeper interdisciplinary work, which really takes a lot of the ecological findings and understandings, in this case of marine protected areas as an example, and starts to unpack the social sort of consequences, and in a rather deep way. And it gets incredibly messy. And this has to be done more and more because there's, the way in which our seas are being managed and used is increasing. And so with every choice that is made on how to manage, on how to block off, on the different rules and restrictions that are put on the ocean, for whatever reason, is leading to these consequences, these really complicated set of impacts for different groups of people. And these are just a few quotes, and this is not, this is here, this is not even abroad, of the Southwest, saying that, it used to be that it was just oil and gas that we had to contend with. And now there's loads of marine protected areas all over the shop, and we're trying to deal with that and navigate that. It's becoming very difficult. And so what I want to end on, and for those of you that know me, this is probably not much of a surprise, is that I think we need this deep interdisciplinary work that considers both ecology and social sciences in particular. But we also need to be aware that it makes the situation far more complicated and can lead to stagnation. It can lead to people being a little bit scared to act, because any action that they take will lead to consequences, sometimes that they can predict that are difficult, and sometimes consequences they can't predict, and not everyone is going to win. The deeper you go into the social sciences in particular, the clearer it is that not everyone is going to win from this situation. There will be trade-offs. So what we're doing at the moment is refining this tool that helps. I say it's a tool. It could be done on a flip chart. It's a series of steps to make people think through the ecological components of the system, the social components of the system, assesses their current health and what things might look like in the future. And if things look worse and certain things look better, well, there we go. There's one of your trade-offs, and we need to pick that out and look into it. And we need to ask ourselves, is this trade-off acceptable? Is it just? Because if it's not just, that's not good in of itself. And if it's not just, your intervention is probably not going to work either. And so that's what it's trying to pick up. But what we're working on now is to try and think through ways to reconcile this complexity, these trade-offs, knowing that we need to act, we need to do something, and it's going to benefit some and likely not benefit others. And how do we define what is acceptable or what can be tolerated or not? And so this is work we're sort of thinking on at the moment. It's very hard to know how to do things the best, but it is very easy to know when what you're doing is terrible. And a lot of what I'm trying to propose is that we put in some red lines, some lines that should not be crossed. By all means, we need to act. So let's put a marine protected area. Let's put this quota system in. Let's put a wind farm in. But we need to make sure that it's not going to push anyone or any aspect of the environment into serious harm. And that's leading me to this notion of tolerance rather than acceptability, because I think confronted in this real world, we're more likely to have to deal with things that aren't immediately palatable, that might just have to be done. And that might be a different way of framing things that needs to happen in the sort of sustainability world. And all of this comes from an interdisciplinary thinking, this journey from ecological to social and then back again. So I hope that made a little bit of sense. I've gone over as usual. Apologies. I answered one question though.
That was great. Thank you, Tom. That was really, really fascinating. So much to kind of consider and take forward from there. Yeah, thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. As I said, I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to dash off. Estelle, are you happy to pick up on the next bit?
I am indeed, standing here
Thank
in the
you very
side wing.
much.
So yeah, great.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Tom. Lovely to meet
absolutely.
you. Cheers.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. It's a huge amount covered, and I think, I mean, my takeaway, much like Suli's presentation a couple of weeks ago, is a lot more questions than answers, but a real nice way to open up some thinking. And you know, we're all scientists here, so we're all trying to come together and think of new ways of working together. So it's a really great presentation and to get us thinking. So we have a couple of questions in the chat, and please, if anybody please put your hand up and I'll come to you as well. So first from Bryony. So I guess, you know, you've mapped out the challenges of doing interdisciplinary work, and Bryony's question was, how do people of different disciplines work together better? I think you've touched on it, but do you have any other thoughts about really, you know, we continue again that disciplinary, what are some of the practical approaches that you think people can take when they are in their discipline and they're maybe keen to start thinking about the multidisciplinary or the interdisciplinary approaches? What do you think some of the good first steps are?
It's a really good question. I mean, this project I was telling you about the ecosystem processes and the goods and the share and the well-being, it was a bunch of people that were friends. It was a bunch of people that were lovely and that were incredibly clever. And it didn't work as planned. I mean, I think we're at the time probably as good as it gets in terms of interdisciplinary work. But if I'm being honest, you know, the ecologists and the social sciences ended up being quite different in many you know, quite far apart. My suggestion would be, you know, there's two forms of interdisciplinarity from my side. The one that's easier to talk about, well, the one that's hard to plan for is if you're an interdisciplinary scientist in of itself. If you're a group of interdisciplinary scientists, then you don't really need to worry too much because you just do your kind of mix of disciplines together, and that's fine. I think if you're in a group of in a project with a group of different disciplines, the best thing is to rally around a conceptual framework, to all agree on how the concepts fit together and the data fits together to answer whatever problem you have, and that the order of things. I think I know this sounds a little bit multidisciplinary, and it might be, but I think it is one of the best ways to work. Is the outputs of one activity feeds into the inputs of another activity, which feeds into the outputs of another one. So mapping what feeds in to each activity is really the key bit, so that we're collecting data that makes sense to other people. The reason why our project wasn't as good as it could have been is that I went in and found out that some of the ecosystem service goods were about, you know, being able to go to the toilet in the mangroves. And the ecologists were like, well, we're not even going to think for a second about foliage cover for protection for that, you know. And so we couldn't map what I was finding to what they were finding. So I think a lot of work in the early stages to really map out the data requirements and how they feed into each other's interests is key.
Brilliant, thank you. Bryony, is there anything else you'd like to get from that, or was that useful?
There it is. No, that was a really lovely answer. Thank you. I like that a lot. Thank you. I like your honesty as well when you say you set out to do something and actually it didn't work. So we can all learn from that.
Super, thank you. Okay, so, sorry, Tom, do you want to come back on that?
No, I was just going to say, don't tell my colleagues that. It was a great project. It was really good. It was an honor to be part of it. And I did actually enjoy it.
You did caveat at the beginning by saying that they were all very nice, so that was good as well. Okay, question from Holly. So again, this is around timing. So funders want to see results impact by the end of the project and program. This messiness is interesting, and I understand why we need to understand this, but this requires long-term timeframes. How do we balance this? So I guess it's that, yeah, that element of having to deliver on time, deliver within funders' requirements, and how do you balance that with that longer term approaches to improving our abilities to look at interdisciplinary work?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think that's why it's nice to have academic projects sometimes that just go in unnecessary amounts of depth, get really confused, and then move on to something else. So I think that's why it's good sometimes to have that. But I mean, I totally understand the issue here. I think we are in a place where a lot of the findings that I had were pretty apparent to people in the communities that I was working in. Not that they necessarily thought about it, but it's knowledge that they all had. And I think if I was to go back and I could get that same kind of information far, 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 far quicker, it would still be complicated, but I would be able to get all that complex information and this messiness in just a couple of focus groups, I think. So a day's work for a community. I don't think you'd have to go in the amount of depth that we went into. The difficulty is what you do with it. And I think for me, that's about identifying the red lines, which I think we've got enough information to do, understanding who's doing incredibly badly in these kinds of communities. And how would this intervention affect them is really what we're trying to find out, and at least prevent from happening, because we know a lot about how to manage the sea and how to manage the marine and coastal environment with the intention that it's going to be better in the long term. Is just what we want to prevent are these terrible outcomes. And I think we can prevent those terrible outcomes quite easily and quite quickly. The problem is funders don't really like "let's prevent terrible outcomes" as their title. I mean, they would much rather a triple win, wouldn't they? And so this is what I'd quite like to change. I'd like to change this language. I think the triple win language is what's actually the most dangerous, because I think it leads to expectations that nature is there to provide you with benefits. Whereas actually, I think it's what we can tolerate now without pushing anyone into serious harm to ensure that we can continue to get something from, and it's a quite depressing way of framing it, but I just think we can act quickly to prevent horrific things from happening. But I think it's very hard to make sure that we can do something really good. I wounded my way around that question, didn't I? I didn't really answer it, but I hope it gets close.
Brilliant, thank you. Is there any other questions? Has anybody got any burning questions? Hands up. Holly, come in.
Sorry, I do have another question. I think it was really thought-provoking presentation. So thank you for kind of showing us the complexities, which I think we all face on a day-to-day basis. And it's something I think we've been facing for quite some time. I've been in a couple of interdisciplinary programs where I think we argued a lot about like terminology, and spend days about how a term means something to one discipline and it means something completely different to another discipline. And I think there's a nervousness also because, there's been this constant back and forth about should we be generalists, should we be specialists, which one is doing better. And I just think, is there a way to have programs that have brokers that can broker information between many disciplines without losing that core speciality that a lot of us have, and is that brokering knowledge being taught in universities and things like that? So not really a question. I don't know what that was, but
no. Well, that's great, because it did two things. It reminded me of the key. I said at one point in the presentation, I was like, "Oh, and this will be my message that I'll say at the end," and I never said it. So I've got the chance now. Thank you, Holly, for reminding me. But I think what one thing that I've never tried actually, which sounds a bit weird, is that I've never been in a project where there's been ecologists, social scientists, and I, for example, am the interdisciplinary scientist. Because I think those people can act as brokers, where you can sort of understand the language by both and try and reconcile. I've never been on a project like that, and I imagine it will probably do a bit of that. But I do think that what I wanted to say is that I think thinking about interdisciplinary interdisciplinarity is maybe not that useful anymore, because I think we've come along very far knowing that the social sciences are incredibly important in this case, and that we need to understand the social and ecological. I think everyone's aware, and I think everyone's equipped to do different things. For me, a far better way of thinking about it is thinking about scale. What's the scale that you're looking at? Okay, so you're looking at the marine protected area, you're looking at what's in it. So you're looking at the, you know, at the nudibranchs, or you're looking at the algae, or you're looking at the fish. Okay, but you're looking at this scale. What about the community? Are you looking at the different individuals? You know, Joseph and Pete and whatever, or are you looking at men and women, or fishers and non-fishers? Are you looking at multiple communities? Are you looking at the whole region? Are you dealing with quite? And I just think understanding temporal and spatial scale would probably get across a lot of what you needed to do. What are the implications of looking at this problem at all these different scales, and what do we need to find out in this case? Might be a way of just not thinking about necessarily language, but thinking about answering questions. Then again, I am a geographer, so I mean, that's not surprising, I would say that.
Brilliant, thank you. Any other questions? We've got 2 more minutes. Is there anybody else out with any other burning questions? Okay, well, I think we just leave to thank Tom hugely for your time. Again, very thought-provoking presentation. More questions than answers, but yeah, as I say, I think that's going to be the theme of this series of teachings. So just to remind everybody that I'm just trying to pull the date up, but we have the next talk will be on turning compliance into community impact, which will be on the 13th of November. So hopefully it's in everybody's diaries. And this recording will be available, so please do share with people that you think would be interested and they haven't attended. So just, yeah, once again, Tom, huge thanks for joining us, and look forward to continually working some of these things through.
Thanks a lot. Lovely to talk to all of you.
Take care, everybody. Bye.